1912, United States. In the quiet farming town of Villisca, Iowa, the air on that June evening was thick with the smell of freshly turned soil and kerosene lamps. Neighbors waved to one another as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the wooden houses in hues of amber and crimson. It was Sunday, and the Moore family, Josiah, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, had spent the day at church, followed by a friendly evening service that stretched into night. Accompanying them were 2 guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, young sisters whose parents had allowed them to stay over. By 10 p.m., the house at 508 East 2nd Street was quiet. The upstairs windows reflected the faint light of the moon, the wind teased the curtains, and the rhythmic chirping of crickets was the only sound breaking the stillness. But inside, something else had crept in, a presence heavy and deliberate. In the darkness of the attic, an intruder waited. No one in Villisca saw him enter. Perhaps he slipped in during the church service, blending into the stream of friendly faces. Perhaps he had been in the house for hours, crouched low, listening to laughter drift up from below. On the dresser in Josiah and Sarah's room lay a small kerosene lamp, its glass chimney removed. Downstairs, the axe leaned quietly against the wall, its blade nicked and blackened with years of use. The house seemed to breathe in the quiet, unaware that its final night had begun. At around midnight, the waiting man moved. The floorboards groaned softly under his boots as he stepped into the main hallway. His hands, calloused and steady, gripped the wooden handle of the axe. The blade caught the moonlight for a heartbeat before the shadow swallowed it again. In the parents' bedroom, Josiah lay nearest to the door. The first blow was so forceful it split bone, sending a muffled thud through the air. Sarah stirred but didn't scream, only a quick gasp before the intruder silenced her too. The killer's work was methodical. The axe rose and fell, each motion punctuated by the sound of splintering wood and wet impact. In the children's room, small bodies stirred under quilts. The youngest, Paul, let out a confused whimper before it was cut short. Herman, Catherine, and Boyd followed, each blow reducing their tiny forms into stillness. The intruder didn't rush. He lingered, his breathing steady. Down the narrow stairs, the Stillinger girls slept in the guest room. 12-year-old Lena might have sensed movement in the dark. Her body was later found lying crosswise on the bed, one arm raised defensively. The signs suggested she had awakened, perhaps even seen his face. But the axe showed no mercy. Ina never moved at all. By the time the killer stopped, the house was drenched in silence. 8 lives extinguished. But the night was not finished with the dead. The man, if man he was, stayed in the house for hours. He covered the mirrors with cloth, as if to hide from his own reflection. He drew curtains tight over windows and draped clothes over the victims' faces, as though erasing them from view. In the kitchen, he ate a slab of bacon from the icebox, leaving the greasy knife on the table. A bowl of water sat nearby, cloudy with the blood he had washed from his hands. When dawn arrived, Villisca began to stir. Roosters called. Horses shifted in their stalls. But the Moore house remained still, shades drawn, doors locked from the inside. By 8 a.m., neighbors grew curious. By 10, they were uneasy. Mary Peckham, the elderly woman next door, knocked but received no answer. Eventually, she summoned Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. His key turned in the lock with a metallic click. The first thing Ross noticed was the stillness. The air was stale, heavy. He stepped into the parlor and called Josiah's name, but his voice was swallowed by the house. Moving down the hallway, he opened the bedroom door and stopped. What he saw would haunt him forever. The coroner was called. So was the sheriff. Soon, word spread like wildfire through Villisca, and a crowd gathered outside, their murmurs tinged with disbelief and fear. Neighbors who had broken bread with the Moores the night before now stood on the dusty street, glancing toward their own homes, wondering if safety had been nothing more than an illusion. Inside, the authorities worked in hushed tones. There were no signs of forced entry. The killer had locked the doors behind him, or perhaps he had never left at all. Fingerprints were smudged and useless. The axe, belonging to Josiah himself, was found in the guest room, its blade wiped but still stained at the edge. The coroner noted the brutality of the blows. Josiah had been struck with such force that his skull was split to the chin. Sarah's head was crushed beyond recognition. Each child had been struck multiple times, far beyond what was needed to kill. It was overkill, personal, deliberate, and drenched in rage. By nightfall, rumors consumed the town. Some said they'd seen a strange man at the edge of town days earlier, his hat pulled low. Others spoke of a drifter spotted boarding a train at dawn. A few whispered about old grudges, secret affairs, and debts unpaid. The sheriff's men interviewed preachers, neighbors, traveling salesmen, even family members. Names began to surface, suspects with motives ranging from jealousy to pure madness. But evidence was thin, and each lead seemed to dissolve like mist at sunrise. And then came the reports from other towns, accounts of eerily similar murders. Families found bludgeoned in their beds, mirrors covered, lamps altered to cast dim, controlled light. A single axe, often taken from the victims' own homes, always the weapon. The press began calling him the man from the train. No one could prove he had been in Villisca. No one could prove he hadn't. Night fell again on the small Iowa town. Doors were barred, windows nailed shut. Parents kept children close, and neighbors eyed strangers with suspicion. Yet even as the streets emptied and lamps were extinguished, there was a lingering sense, an unspoken fear, that the killer was still out there, watching, waiting. And somewhere, perhaps in the shadows of another quiet town, a man in a dark coat might be standing at the edge of a field, watching the lights of a farmhouse flicker and dim. The cycle was not over. It was only beginning. The days after the murders blurred into a feverish blend of grief, suspicion, and dread. Villisca was no longer the town it had been. Its charm had soured. Even the air felt different, thicker, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The Moore house became a grim attraction. Locals, unable to comprehend the enormity of the crime, streamed through in a grotesque procession. They walked room to room, stepping around the dark stains on the floorboards, some covering their noses against the metallic scent that still lingered. One woman reached out and touched the bedpost where Josiah had died, as if expecting to feel a trace of him in the wood. The sheriff tried to maintain order, but in truth, the scene had already been compromised. Footprints, fingerprints, anything of value, had been trampled, smudged, or taken as morbid souvenirs. Yet, for all the contamination, certain details refused to fade. The covered mirrors, the drawn shades, the piece of bacon left untouched beside the bloodied water. To some, these were the actions of a man who feared being seen, even by himself. To others, they were ritualistic, an echo of something older and darker than mere murder. The whispers about the man from the train grew louder. A string of unsolved murders from Kansas to Illinois bore his signature. Whole families slain in the night, often with the blunt end of an axe. He never stole money, rarely left signs of forced entry, and vanished before sunrise. But there was something different about Villisca. The coroner's report mentioned hesitation wounds on Lena Stillinger's arm, defensive marks suggesting she had seen her killer. Her fingernails were broken, as though she had clawed at something or someone. On the wall near her bed, faint smears hinted at a struggle. These small resistances seemed to defy the killer's usual efficiency. Could that have been his mistake? As the investigation widened, suspicion fell on Frank Jones, a local businessman with a long-standing feud against Josiah Moore. Rumor had it Josiah had stolen not only Jones's best salesman, but also his pride. Some claimed there had been an affair. Whispers passed in hushed tones that grew more sordid with each telling. But Jones had an alibi, and the sheriff, though privately unconvinced, lacked the evidence to press further. Then came the traveling preacher. Reverend George Kelly was a slight, twitchy man with a high, nervous voice. He had attended the same church service as the Moors that night, and witnesses claimed he had been unusually fixated on the children. Days later, Kelly confessed to the murders in a rambling statement, describing details only someone at the scene could know. Yet his confession shifted with each retelling, and he later recanted, claiming the police had coerced him. Still, fragments of his testimony clung to the town's imagination, especially his mention of the attic, of waiting in the dark, of the moment the house went quiet. But the most chilling account came not from Kelly, nor the police, but from an old man who lived on the outskirts of town. He claimed that in the early hours of that Monday morning, he had been awakened by the sound of footsteps on the gravel road. At first, he thought it was a neighbor heading to the barn early, but then he saw a figure in the distance, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The man did not hurry. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait, the handle of something long and heavy protruding from his coat. The old man had called out, but the figure never turned. By the time the sheriff visited, the trail had grown cold. The train heading east had left before dawn. If the killer was aboard, he was already gone, leaving only his shadow in Villisca. Still, the fear refused to leave. The townsfolk began sleeping with weapons at hand, shotguns propped against bed frames, axes tucked behind doors. Doors that had once been left open through the night were now bolted, barred, and sometimes nailed shut entirely. Children were warned not to linger after dark, and women walked in pairs, eyes darting toward alleys and tree lines. Yet deep down, everyone knew it was a futile defense. If he wanted in, he would find a way. He always did. And then 2 weeks later, another family was found dead in the same manner, this time in a town nearly 100 miles away. The same patterns, the same silence, the same careful covering of the victims' faces. The cycle had resumed. And in Villisca, a few swore they saw him again, just a shape, watching from the edge of the cornfields at dusk. A still, dark figure, waiting for the right night, the right house, the right silence. The summer heat clung to the earth like a fever, heavy and oppressive. In Villisca, the fields of corn grew tall and thick, their rustling leaves whispering to one another in the windless nights. People said the land was restless now, that the ground remembered what had been spilled on it, and that the air carried it still. Sheriff Horton had taken to walking the streets after dark, his revolver heavy at his hip. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the way the town had changed unnerved him. Curtains were never left open anymore. Laughter had vanished from the porches. Even the church bells seemed muted. Then came the sighting. 2 boys, brothers aged 13 and 10, swore they had seen a man standing in the alley behind their house just after midnight. They described him as tall, wearing a brimmed hat that shadowed his face, holding something long in his hand. When the older boy whispered to the younger, the man tilted his head slowly, as if acknowledging them. But when their father came outside with a lantern, the alley was empty, and the dust underfoot showed no footprints. A week later, the strange occurrences began. Barn doors found standing wide open in the morning, when they had been bolted the night before. Tools moved from one side of the shed to the other without explanation. A loaf of bread missing from a windowsill. And in one case, the sound of someone walking slowly through a kitchen while the family hid upstairs, too afraid to call out. By the time the men of the household mustered the courage to search, the door was ajar, and the yard beyond was empty. What made it worse was the news from outside Villisca. A small farming town west of the Missouri River was shaken by an eerily similar massacre. A family of 5, all struck down in their sleep, with no signs of robbery, no forced entry, and faces covered after death. The axe was found in the yard, leaning against the fence, its blade facing the road. The papers didn't name Villisca, but the people here didn't need them to. They knew. One sweltering August night, the sheriff and a few armed townsmen decided to bait the killer. They set up a watch in the Moore house itself, which by now had been abandoned, its wooden floors stripped bare, the air thick with the smell of old blood that never quite washed out. The men sat in silence, the only sound the creak of the structure settling and the faint ticking of a mantel clock. At 2:17 a.m., it stopped ticking. The sheriff later said it wasn't broken. It simply stopped, as though time itself was holding its breath. Moments later came the sound, slow, deliberate footsteps on the front porch. The men waited for the latch to move. It didn't. Instead, the steps moved along the boards, pausing just outside the front window. There was a faint scrape, like gloved fingers sliding across glass. The sheriff gripped his revolver, nodding to the others to stay silent. And then, as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps moved away, fading into the yard until there was nothing left but the sound of their own breathing. When they finally stepped outside at dawn, the grass in the front yard was wet with dew, except for a single path of dry blades leading to the road. The path ended abruptly, as though the man had vanished mid-step. From that night on, sightings multiplied. Farmers claimed to see a tall man walking along the fence lines at dusk. Children whispered of a figure crouched at the edge of the schoolyard, watching until they were dismissed. A woman swore she awoke to the sound of her back door opening and closing, though nothing was missing. The sheriff feared it was only a matter of time before Villisca would have another night like that one in June. And in the killer's methodical way, he knew the man was choosing, studying, waiting, and when the time came, there would be no warning. The first frost of autumn crept across the fields like a slow-moving infection, whitening the tips of cornstalks and dusting the ground in a thin, brittle crust. By now, Villisca had settled into a strange routine. Life carried on, but under a constant, low hum of dread. The killer had not struck in weeks, but that absence was its own kind of violence. It was not peace. It was the pause before something breaks. On the night it happened, the Kramer family had gone to bed as usual. Their house stood near the northern edge of town, a modest, two-story farmhouse set back from the main road. Thomas Kramer, a widower, lived there with his 14-year-old daughter, Ruth, and his elderly mother. They were not rich, but the house was well kept, and Thomas, like most in Villisca, had taken precautions since the murders. Windows locked, doors barred, a shotgun leaning against the wall by his bed. That night was colder than most, and the wind carried a faint, metallic tang from the railroad tracks half a mile away. Inside, the family slept under heavy quilts, the warmth of the wood stove lingering faintly in the air. At 1:46 a.m., Ruth woke to a sound she could not place. It wasn't the creak of the house, nor the rattle of loose shingles in the wind. This was closer, slower, the sound of wood shifting under weight, footsteps on the porch. She lay frozen, her breath shallow. The steps moved from the front door to the window beside it, stopping directly outside her room. The thin curtain glowed faintly from the moonlight beyond, and in that faint glow she saw it, a shadow, tall and still, filling the frame. She wanted to scream for her father, but the fear had welded her voice in place. The shadow didn't move, didn't knock, didn't try the latch. It simply stood there, and even from inside, Ruth could feel the weight of its presence. When it moved again, it was not away from the house, but along the wall toward the side entrance. She heard the faint rattle of the back door handle. Locked. A pause. Then the soft, patient scrape of metal against metal. She sat up in bed, the quilt falling to the floor. From her father's room came the sound of the bed creaking, then heavy footsteps in the hall. Thomas appeared in her doorway, his shotgun in one hand, his face pale in the moonlight. He didn't speak, just pressed a finger to his lips. The sound at the door stopped. They waited. Then came the noise from inside. A slow, deliberate creak from the kitchen floorboards. Thomas stepped forward, raising the shotgun, his feet silent on the rug. He glanced at Ruth, motioning for her to get behind him. The old woman, woken by the sound, peered from the top of the stairs, clutching her shawl. The man was in the house. From the dark kitchen came the faint, unmistakable sound of a chair leg scraping against the floor, as if someone had sat down, uninvited, unhurried. Thomas leveled the shotgun at the doorway and stepped forward. His breath clouded faintly in the cold air leaking through the walls. The silence was so complete that the ticking of the mantel clock seemed deafening. Then movement. A tall figure stepped into view. He wore a long, dark coat, and his wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow. In his right hand, the dull gleam of an axe head caught the moonlight from the window. He stopped just at the threshold of the room, not advancing, not retreating. For several seconds, no one moved. The only sound was the faint whistle of wind through the chimney. "Get out," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. The man tilted his head slightly, as though considering the command. The movement was unnervingly slow, deliberate, and when he straightened again, Thomas felt the weight of something colder than malice. It was patience. The figure took one step forward. Thomas fired. The blast shook the small house, the sound ricocheting through the walls. But the figure was already moving, not back into the kitchen, but sideways, impossibly fast for his size, vanishing into the shadows between the kitchen and the hall. The shotgun smoke curled in the air, stinging their eyes. Thomas reloaded with shaking hands, his ears ringing, and advanced into the kitchen. The chair was still there, pushed back slightly from the table. On the worn-wood surface sat an untouched cup, steam curling faintly from within. Thomas hadn't made tea. From somewhere in the house, upstairs impossibly, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. Thomas turned toward the stairs, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Ruth clung to the doorway, her eyes wide, her voice a choked whisper. He went up. They followed, the boards underfoot groaning with each step. The old woman stayed behind, clutching the kitchen doorway like a lifeline. The upstairs hallway stretched ahead, the moonlight from a small window spilling, just enough to see the first bedroom door standing open. Inside, nothing. The second door, also open, revealed the same. But the third door at the far end was closed. Thomas raised the shotgun and approached, the wood floor cold against his bare feet. He reached for the knob, and from behind that door came the faintest sound, a slow, steady drip. When he opened it, the room was empty. The window stood open, the curtains swaying in the cold night air. On the floor beneath the window, a small wet patch darkened the wood. It was water. They searched the yard until sunrise, but found no footprints, no sign of a man running or walking away. The frost on the grass was untouched. And yet, that morning, as the pale light crept over the cornfields, Ruth swore she saw something at the far edge of the property. Just a dark shape, too far to make out, standing perfectly still in the brittle grass. Watching. By sunrise, the Kramer incident was the only thing anyone in Villisca was talking about. The fact that he had been inside a home, again, was chilling enough, but the detail that chilled everyone most was what Thomas Kramer swore in his statement. The killer had not come to kill that night. He had come to be seen. Sheriff Horton took it as both a warning and an invitation. If the man wanted to be noticed, then perhaps they could bait him again, on their own terms. But Horton also knew he was dealing with a predator who picked his moments with surgical precision. The investigation in the Kramer house turned up little. The cup of tea was still warm when found, but the water in it had no scent, no taste, just plain boiled water, as though the man had been marking his presence with something unsettlingly domestic. The open window upstairs had no footprints in the frost beneath it, and the drip Ruth had heard? It came from the melting frost on the window frame, or so the sheriff told himself, though he didn't entirely believe it. That night, Horton set his trap. He placed 2 deputies in the shadows of the Moore house, with instructions to remain silent and unseen. He himself positioned near the train tracks, reasoning that if the man came or left that way, he might catch him in the open. Several armed townsmen stayed in their homes, watching from windows, waiting for movement. Nothing happened. For 4 nights, the watch continued, and the town's nerves frayed thinner. People slept in fits, half expecting to wake to an axe head in the dark. Children whimpered in their sleep, and dogs barked at shadows in the fields. By the 5th night, Horton feared the killer had slipped away entirely. Then came the 6th night. It began with silence, too much of it. No wind, no dogs, no distant hum of train wheels over steel. And then, just before 2 a.m., the telegraph operator at the small depot swore he saw a tall man walking along the track toward town, carrying something heavy over his shoulder. The figure stopped near the signal post and looked directly toward the depot's lit window before vanishing into the darkness. At 2:23 a.m., the killer struck. But not in Villisca. The neighboring town of Lennox, 20 miles west, was roused by the news before dawn. An entire family, father, mother, and 3 children, had been butchered in their beds. The scene was near identical to Villisca. Covered mirrors, drawn shades, the axe left behind. But there was something new. In the smallest child's room, on the wall just above the bed, written in a shaky, uneven scrawl, were the words, "You missed your chance." The sheriff read the message himself when he arrived at the Lennox house later that morning. The letters had been drawn in soot, possibly from the chimney, and the unevenness suggested the writer's hand had been trembling, or perhaps he had been writing quickly. If the message was for him, then the meaning was clear. The killer had known about the trap. He had been close enough to sense it, maybe close enough to see them waiting in the Moore house that week. And instead of walking into it, he had moved like smoke through the night, slipping past their nets and delivering his own blow elsewhere. The train lines connecting Villisca and Lennox became Horton's obsession. Every conductor and switchman was questioned. Several remembered seeing a man in a long coat boarding at a small, unmanned stop outside Villisca hours before the murders in Lennox. None had seen him disembark. But the strangest testimony came from a farmer named Carl de Vries, whose land bordered a stretch of track about 10 miles west of Villisca. Carl claimed that around midnight on the night of the Lennox killings, he had been awakened by the sound of someone whistling, low, slow, and tuneless, just outside his bedroom window. When he finally dared to look, he saw a tall figure walking along the fence line, the moonlight glinting off something metal in his hand. The whistling had continued until the man disappeared into the tree line toward the tracks. Horton tried to keep the detail about the whistling quiet, but word spread fast in towns this small. Soon, reports poured in from other farms. A tall man, sometimes whistling, sometimes humming, always walking alone in the dark. It became the sound the town feared most. 2 weeks passed. Then, just after midnight on a Wednesday, a woman named Clara Sanderson woke in her farmhouse outside Villisca to the faint, eerie sound of whistling, this time coming from inside her kitchen. She did not scream. She did not move. She simply closed her eyes and waited for the sound to fade. It never did. By morning, her neighbors found the back door ajar, a chair pulled out from the table, and a cup of water on the counter. Clara was gone. The search for Clara Sanderson began before dawn. Her nearest neighbors, the Myers family, found her house just after sunrise, back door wide open, the kitchen chair pushed back as if she had risen in a hurry. The cup of water on the counter still bore a faint warmth, like it had been drawn only hours earlier. Her bed was neatly made. Her shoes were missing. Sheriff Horton arrived within the hour, his face ashen. He ordered every able-bodied man in Villisca to form a line and sweep the fields. They moved slowly through the frost-stiff grass, boots crunching, eyes darting to every shadow between the corn stalks. But it wasn't long before they found something. About a quarter-mile from Clara's home, near the edge of the Myers cornfield, the searchers discovered a patch of flattened grass. In the center lay one of Clara's slippers, its leather sole damp with dew, as though it had been dropped, no taken, while she was still moving. There were footprints, but not many. Just 2 sets, Clara's smaller steps pressed deeper at odd intervals as though she had stumbled, and larger ones beside them, each print deliberate, evenly spaced. The larger steps showed no sign of running. Whoever had taken her wasn't rushing. The tracks led toward the railroad line. By mid-morning, they found the second slipper, lying in the dirt by the wooden trestle bridge. Beside it, barely visible in the mud, were the faint outlines of knuckles, as if someone had knelt there, watching the black water flow below. It was Deputy O'Hara who spotted the mark carved into one of the trestle's beams. A crude X, dug deep into the wood with the point of a blade or the corner of an axe head. Horton touched it, his jaw tightening. This was no random mark. This was his sign. They crossed the trestle carefully, following the prints into the thick timber beyond. The forest here was old, the kind that swallowed sound, the damp smell of earth heavy in the lungs. It was O'Hara who stopped first, his hand shooting up for silence. Somewhere ahead, faint but distinct, came the sound of humming. Not a song, not even a tune, just a slow, uneven hum, rising and falling without pattern. The men moved forward, hearts pounding. Through the trees they spotted her. Clara was sitting on the ground, her dress torn at the hem, hair tangled, her face pale but conscious. She wasn't bound, but she didn't move. Her eyes were locked on something behind her, a shadow just out of sight. When Horton called her name, she flinched, glancing toward them before immediately looking back over her shoulder. That's when they saw him. The tall man stepped from behind the trees, the brim of his hat low, his long coat brushing the ground. The handle of the axe was visible, resting on his shoulder like a farmer might carry a tool after a day's work. He didn't run, didn't even seem startled. He just stood there, tilting his head in that slow, unnerving way Ruth Kramer had described. Horton leveled his revolver. Let her go. The man didn't move for several seconds. Then, with an unsettling calm, he placed the axe head down in the dirt beside him and stepped back into the shadows. When the deputies rushed forward, they found nothing, no sign of him in any direction. The forest swallowed him whole. Clara, when they reached her, was shaking violently, unable to speak at first. When she finally found her voice, it came in fragments. He wasn't in a hurry. He wanted me to walk. Just walk. Every time I slowed, he tapped the handle on the ground, not hard, just enough to hear. I thought if I ran. She stopped, swallowing hard, and then whispered, he'd start using the sharp end. When Horton asked what he looked like, she shook her head. Never saw his face. Always the hat. Always the shadow. They got her back to town, but the damage was done. The fact that he could take someone, walk them through open farmland, through forest, and vanish within sight of armed men, proved something far more terrifying than anyone wanted to admit. He wasn't just killing at random. He was practicing. That night, the townsfolk stayed awake until dawn, guns ready, lamps lit, curtains drawn. But Horton knew better. The killer wouldn't strike again so soon. No, he would wait, because waiting was what he did best. And when he came again, it would be for more than one. It began with the wind. 3 nights after Clara Sanderson was found, a hard, cold wind swept in from the north, rattling the rooftops and bending the bare branches until they scraped against the sides of houses. The town hunkered down early, chimneys belching smoke into the black sky. Even the tavern closed before midnight. Sheriff Horton didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, a single oil lamp burning, his revolver disassembled in front of him. He wasn't cleaning it out of habit, he was waiting. Deep in his gut, he felt it. The killer had been too close, too deliberate. Clara's abduction had been a test, and now the real strike was coming. At 1:12 a.m., the telegraph operator banged on the sheriff's office door. Trouble, he panted. South edge of town, lights in the Jensen place. But, sir, the Jensens aren't home. The Jensen family had left for Omaha 2 days earlier, leaving the farmhouse locked and empty. If there were lights inside, they didn't belong to anyone living there. Horton grabbed his coat, called 2 deputies, and rode hard for the south road. By the time they reached the property, the wind had died completely. The air was so still that the sound of the horses' breathing seemed unnaturally loud. The farmhouse stood dark, except for one upstairs window. A single low orange glow flickered there, not like a lamp, but like firelight caught behind moving shapes. Horton signaled for the men to dismount. They moved in silence, boots crunching faintly on the frost. As they approached, Horton noticed something in the yard: footprints. Dozens of them, circling the house in slow, deliberate loops. They weren't rushed. They were patterns, like someone had been pacing the perimeter over and over, wearing a track into the frozen earth. At the front door, Horton tried the handle. It turned without resistance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and something metallic. The glow from upstairs pulsed faintly, as though the flame were breathing. The 3 men crept up the staircase, shotguns at the ready. Halfway up, they heard it, a low, steady humming, the same tuneless sound Clara had described. They reached the landing and turned toward the lit room. The door was half open. Horton pushed it the rest of the way with the barrel of his gun. Inside, the room was empty. The glow came from a small oil lamp on the floor, its chimney removed, the flame burning low. Beside it lay a neatly stacked pile of the Jensen family's blankets, and on top of them, an axe. The handle was polished, the blade recently sharpened. On the far wall, written in broad, uneven strokes of ash, were the words, "Not this house." Horton felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Then from outside came the sound of a scream. The 3 men bolted to the window. Across the dark fields, in the direction of town, a cluster of lights was flickering wildly, lanterns swinging in frantic hands. Another scream cut through the stillness, followed by a sound Horton knew too well, the dull, heavy thud of wood striking flesh. They raced downstairs and into the yard. From here they could see it clearly. The lights were coming from the old Brantner place, on the eastern edge of town. The deputies mounted up, but Horton was already running, boots pounding the dirt road, his breath clouding in the cold. When they reached the Brantner house, the front door was open, swinging in the wind. Inside, chaos. Furniture overturned, a chair smashed, blood pooling across the kitchen floorboards. But this time, something was different. The Brantners weren't dead. They were gone. The beds upstairs were empty, the quilts thrown back. In the smallest room, a child's doll lay in the doorway, one glass eye missing. The back door was wide open, and in the yard beyond, fresh footprints led into the night, several sets, large and small. The killer had taken the whole family. Within an hour, the entire town was awake. Men armed themselves and set out in every direction, lanterns bobbing through the dark. Women huddled in locked houses, whispering prayers. The trail of prints led north, toward the tree line. Horton and a dozen armed townsmen followed, the lantern light stretching and shrinking with their pace. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Then they found the first sign. A child's shoe, half buried in the frost. 20 yards later, they found a man's hat, crushed and damp. And then nothing. The track stopped. Not faded, not scattered, stopped entirely, in the middle of a clearing. The men searched for hours, but there was no trace of the Brantners. No bodies. No footprints leaving the clearing. Just the empty space, and the lingering echo of that low, inhuman humming. By dawn, the searchers returned to town, empty-handed and hollow-eyed. Horton knew in his bones that the Brantners were already gone. He also knew the killer had done this deliberately, not just to take lives, but to show that he could take anyone, anywhere, and vanish without a trace. It wasn't just murder anymore. It was siege. The night it happened began without warning. December 2nd, 1912. The first snow of the season had fallen in the afternoon, muffling the streets of Villisca under a heavy, white quilt. The lamps glowed faintly through frosted windows, and the town seemed, at least for a moment, peaceful. But Sheriff Horton didn't trust the quiet anymore. He'd been making his rounds late into the evening, boots crunching over the hard snow, scanning the shadows that pooled between houses. The Brantner family had been gone for 12 days. No trace, no ransom, no bodies. And yet, in his gut, Horton felt the killer hadn't left town at all. He was still here, moving in the dark, patient as frost forming on glass. At 11:48 p.m., the first knock came. It was soft, almost polite, at the Miller residence on Main Street. Henry Miller, half asleep in his chair, opened the door without thinking. His wife later swore she heard him say, "Evenin', friend," before his voice cut off into a wet, choking sound. By the time she reached the doorway, Henry was on the floor, blood spilling from a wound in his temple. The street outside was empty. At 11:56 p.m., the O'Leary family, 2 blocks east, heard boots crunching across their porch. The eldest son, Patrick, peeked through the curtain. A tall man in a long coat stood in the snow, holding something over his shoulder. Patrick didn't open the door. He blew out the lamp and herded his siblings upstairs. Minutes later, they heard the sound of their back door creaking open, followed by slow, steady footsteps moving through the kitchen. At 12:07 a.m., lantern light began flickering in the streets. People were waking, moving, shouting warnings. Horton was halfway down Broad Street when the second scream cut through the night, a raw, tearing sound from the McGuire house. He sprinted, his breath burning in his chest, but as he rounded the corner, he saw something that turned his stomach cold. The killer wasn't in a house. He was in the street. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low. The axe swung lazily in one hand, catching the pale moonlight. Behind him, 2 men lay motionless in the snow, their blood steaming in the cold. Horton raised his revolver and fired. The shot echoed off the walls of the buildings, but the man didn't fall. He stepped sideways into an alley, disappearing as though he'd stepped through a curtain. By now, chaos had swallowed Villisca. Lamps flared in windows, shouts carried through the streets, and the sound of gunfire cracked the still air as frightened townsfolk shot at shadows. Doors were barred, curtains drawn, but the killer didn't need to force his way in every time. Sometimes, the sound of him testing a latch or tapping an axe handle on the wall was enough to drive people into panic. Horton tried to rally the men, but the killer moved like smoke, never staying in one place for more than seconds. At 12:19 a.m., the Perkins house on Walnut Street reported a figure standing in their upstairs hallway. At 12:23 a.m., someone was seen crossing the frozen river toward the rail yard. At 12:27 a.m., the sound of humming was heard near the church, just before its front door slammed shut. It was as if there were 3 of him, everywhere at once. By midnight, the town was under siege. Some men tried to form search parties, but gunshots and screams kept scattering them. Horton realized the killer wasn't here to wipe out the town, he was here to break it. Moving from door to door, letting people see him, letting them hear his boots in the snow, making sure no one knew where he'd be next. At 12:41 a.m., a barn on the edge of town caught fire. As men rushed to put it out, they left their homes unguarded. Horton later learned that during those frantic minutes, the Adams family vanished from their beds. No bodies, no struggle, just gone. By 1:15 a.m., the streets had emptied. Everyone was locked inside, weapons clutched in trembling hands. The only sounds were the creak of ice on the rooftops and the occasional faint tap, tap, tap of an axe handle somewhere in the snow. When dawn came, the streets were littered with strange signs, single sets of footprints that stopped mid-path, doors standing open on houses that had been locked hours earlier, and in the center of Main Street, burned into the snow with black ash, a single word: soon. No one saw him leave. The decision to hunt him wasn't made in a moment of courage. It was made in a moment of desperation. By the morning after the siege, Villisca was barely functioning. Half the town hadn't slept. The other half refused to speak above a whisper. The schoolhouse was shuttered, the church doors chained, and every able-bodied man carried a weapon openly in the streets. Sheriff Horton stood in the cold light of the depot, staring at the fresh snow along the rail line. A single set of tracks led north, boot prints, spaced long as if the man walked with an easy, confident stride. They weren't hurried. They weren't hiding. It was a message: follow me. 8 men volunteered before noon: farmers, shopkeepers, 2 railway workers, and Father Mallory, the town's gaunt, sharp-eyed priest. Horton didn't know whether the priest had come to save souls or bury them, but he didn't refuse the help. By sundown, they were saddled and ready, with lanterns, rifles, and the grim resolve of men who no longer cared if they came back. The first hours were simple. The tracks followed the rails, straight as a taut rope, past frozen fields and skeletal stands of oak. The air was bitter, the only sounds the crunch of boots and the hiss of breath in scarves. But as the night deepened, things began to change. The tracks no longer clung to the rails. They veered off into the prairie, looping back and crossing over themselves, like the man was drawing patterns in the snow. Sometimes the prince doubled back toward Villisca before turning away again, as though he were mocking their pursuit. By 1 a.m., the lantern light fell on something none of them could explain: a half-buried iron key in the snow, its bow carved into the shape of a human eye. They pressed on, into a shallow valley where the wind died completely. The stillness was wrong, soundless, like the air itself was holding its breath. Even the horses began to fidget, ears twitching at something the men couldn't hear. At 1:43 a.m., they found the barn. It stood alone in the hollow, sagging under its own weight, its boards weathered gray and split. No tracks led in or out, except the ones they were following. Horton lit his lantern high, casting a yellow halo over the snow. The prince stopped at the barn door, which hung slightly open, breathing a faint, warm mist into the cold. "Careful," Horton whispered, though he didn't know why. His voice seemed too loud in the airless dark. They pushed inside. The smell hit them first: rot, wood smoke, and something sweet and coppery. The floor was covered in straw, but beneath it, Horton's boots struck something hard. He kicked the straw aside and froze. Floorboards had been pried up, revealing a pit. Not a deep one, just enough to hide what lay inside. The Brantners, all of them, laid out neatly, as though sleeping, hands folded on their chests. Their faces were pale but intact, no visible wounds except for the faint, dark bruises circling their throats. Each wore a strip of cloth tied over their eyes. Father Mallory knelt beside them, lips moving silently. The others stood back, weapons tight in their fists. Then Horton noticed something worse. They weren't cold. Before he could speak, a voice came from the loft above. "You made good time." The men spun, rifles raised. A figure crouched in the shadows of the rafters, face hidden beneath a brimmed hat. The light from Horton's lantern caught the blade of an axe resting on his shoulder. "I thought you'd take longer," the voice went on. "It's no fun if you don't take your time." Horton fired. The shot tore into the loft, but the figure was already gone, slipping into the dark like smoke. Above them, boots thudded on wood, and then the sound of something heavy hitting the snow outside. They burst from the barn, but the world had changed. The valley they'd entered was gone. The barn stood now in a dense black forest, trees packed so close the moonlight couldn't touch the ground. Their horses were gone. The tracks they'd followed had vanished. And somewhere ahead, that low, tuneless humming began again. It wasn't one voice this time. It was many. Father Mallory's lantern flickered. Horton felt the eyes of the others on him, waiting for a command he didn't have. The humming grew louder, coming from all directions now, deep, resonant, vibrating in their chests like the thrum of distant machinery. Then the forest lit up, not with fire, but with faint, shifting shapes between the trees, tall, pale outlines, each holding something long in their hands. Axes. The men closed in instinctively, backs together, weapons ready. The outlines moved closer, too many to count, their features hidden in the dark. The humming had shifted into a rhythm, rising and falling in time with the slow drag of boots on the frozen ground. Horton realized, too late, that they hadn't been hunting the killer. They'd been led to them. The first figure stepped into the lantern light, and the truth hit like ice water. This wasn't the man from Villisca. This was someone else. And behind them, dozens more shapes stood still, watching, their axes catching faint glints of moonlight. The man in the hat's voice came again, from somewhere beyond the ring of shapes. Now you see it. The town was never the point. Something moved in the shadows behind Horton. A hand, not cold, but clammy and strong, clamped over his mouth, and the world tilted into blackness. He woke to the sound of iron wheels turning slowly in the dark. The air smelled of coal and rust. He was lying on the floor of what felt like a train car, the board swaying beneath him. Shapes shifted in the gloom, other men tied, gagged, their eyes wide with terror. Through a crack in the wall, Horton saw the faint smear of moonlight on snow rushing past. Wherever they were going, it wasn't back to Villisca, and above the sound of the wheels, faint but steady, the humming began again. The train car jolted sharply, rattling Horton's senses. His throat was raw, his mouth dry under the rough cloth gag, but he forced himself to listen, to every creak, every whisper in the dark. Somewhere ahead, the humming swelled, no longer distant, but inside his bones. The others stirred, eyes searching the gloom, reflecting panic and disbelief. Horton's fingers itched for a weapon, for a chance, but there was none. Only the slow, inevitable pull of the rails. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe mere moments. Time seemed twisted here, as if the train was moving through a place outside the world. Then suddenly the car stopped. The men's breaths caught, the silence thick and suffocating. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. The door slammed open. Light spilled in, cold, white, clinical. A figure stepped through, face obscured by shadow, but the unmistakable glint of an axe resting on their shoulder. "Welcome," the voice said, calm and void of warmth. "You've come far, but the journey ends here." Horton's eyes met the gaze beneath the brimmed hat, the same voice, the same man who had vanished in the barn's loft. He realized the truth, bitter and final. The town was never the point. It had been a trap, a lure, a promise that justice could be served, when in fact it was a sentence already passed. The axe gleamed as it rose. And then, silence. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the train car sat empty on a side track, its door hanging open. No footprints led away. No cries echoed. Just the faint hum in the wind. Villisca never found peace. And the man with the axe, he was never seen again. But sometimes, in the stillness of a cold Iowa night, when the wind shifts just right, you can hear it, the soft, relentless humming. A reminder that some hunts never end, and some killers never stop walking.